The history of crimes in the sky is littered with near misses that rarely make the news. But the story of Federal Express Flight 705 could have been even more devastating than the tragedy at Lockerbie. 24 hours a day, a FedEx jet makes a pickup or a delivery somewhere around the globe. From its nerve center in Memphis, Tennessee, the company operates over 600 aircraft, the world's largest cargo fleet, and employs 3,500 pilots to fly them. One of those pilots was 43-year-old Auburn Calloway, a U.S. Navy-trained flyer. In April 1994, Calloway was serving as flight engineer on one of the company's wide-bodied DC-10s. Richard Boyle is a Vietnam veteran who's flown for FedEx since it first took off 25 years ago. In April 1994, he was Auburn Calloway's captain. They flew together on long-haul flights across the states.
Well, Auburn didn't have a good reputation in the company because he just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I think it might have been first impressions. My first impression of Auburn wasn't a positive one either. But once I got to know him, we got along fine. But many of the captains did not like to fly with Auburn.
Calloway was not only unpopular, he was also under investigation. FedEx believed he'd lied to them about his Navy flying time. Calloway thought that FedEx was out to get him because he was black.
He felt that he was being persecuted by one of our flight managers. He felt it was a personal vendetta. And that's one thing FedEx will not tolerate, and that's someone lying regarding their credentials. So if he lost his job at FedEx, he would never get hired by another major air carrier. I mean, his aviation career with any good company was basically over.
Fellow flyer and Memphis newspaperman Dave Hirschman uncovered more about Calloway's character while researching a book he wrote on the incident.
During the time that he was in the Navy, he kept a book of all the slights and all the indignities and every perceived injustice that anyone had ever perpetrated against him. And he kept that book, and he kept the little black leather-bound book and added to it on an almost daily basis.
A lifetime of slights had worn Calloway down. He decided to end his life. In a farewell note, he wrote, "I have battle fatigue badly. It's my time to go." But Auburn Calloway had no intention of going quietly. Skyjackers rarely target non-passenger aircraft. That's what made Auburn Calloway's scheme so diabolical.
Calloway's plan was to knock out Federal Express. He wanted to strike at the very nerve center of this very complex, worldwide, global organization. And his method of doing that was to commandeer a DC-10, fully loaded with fuel, and to crash that airplane into the FedEx nerve center at Memphis International Airport. When you think about a 500,000-pound jet with 100,000 pounds of jet fuel on board, moving at over 350 miles per hour, and targeted at a particular location, the devastation would have been incalculable.
FedEx has a long-standing policy. Any employee can fly free on any FedEx aircraft in the jump seat, which is located right behind the pilot on the flight deck. On April 7th, 1994, Calloway buckled himself into the jump seat of Flight 705, a DC-10 loaded with electronics destined for California's Silicon Valley.
Very cool, calm, collected, nothing indicating anything was amiss.
Heading 310, cleared for takeoff.
The plane took off from runway 9 at Memphis Airport at 3:02 in the afternoon. Part of Calloway's plan was for his family to benefit from his company life insurance. But for his policy to pay out, he had to make his suicide mission look like an accident.
What he intended to do was to use hammers to incapacitate the crew, and you know, hammers may seem like a primitive weapon, but when you think about it, it's the perfect weapon. The wounds that they would cause would be every bit as devastating as gunshots. And later, when forensic experts examined the wreckage, they would find crew members with fractured skulls, but those injuries are totally consistent with an airline crash.
26 minutes after takeoff at 19,000 feet, Calloway took out his hammer. In the cockpit were his FedEx colleagues, Captain David Sanders, First Officer Jim Tucker, and Flight Engineer Andy Peterson.
And the first thing he does is he delivers two devastating hammer blows to Andy Peterson. Andy Peterson was seated with his back to Calloway, and he was hit twice. And the impact of these hammer blows, they fractured Peterson's skull and severed the temporal artery on the top of his scalp.
I just caught him out of the corner of my eye and basically saw his, his arm coming up, and I thought, well, he's just coming up to sit and talk with us for a while.
Jim Tucker was turning his head to the left to ask Peterson if he could identify the noise, and at that time he was struck with an absolutely devastating blow. The hammer is a 20-ounce Stanley framing hammer, and it actually went through his skull, right about where he would have parted his hair. The hammer went into his brain, and Tucker was immediately paralyzed on one side of his body. He was losing vision. The impact of this blow literally bounced his face off of the instrument panel in front of him.
So much, in fact, that I never lost consciousness, but I lost useful consciousness for at least 45 seconds.
David Sanders was still strapped into his seat. He had his hands up over his head. He was moving in his seat, trying to ward off these hammer blows, and he was struck several times. One of the blows nearly severed his ear, his right ear. Calloway expected these guys to be dead from these mortal wounds that he had delivered, but instead that they were still alert, and they were shouting to each other and exhorting each other to fight back.
Calloway's plan was going wrong, and he retreated from the cockpit in panic. The blood-spattered Sanders and Peterson forced themselves out of their seats and went after him. They found Calloway holding a Magnum underwater spear gun, which he'd carried on board in a guitar case.
The only thing I can do is try to grab it. So I grabbed the spear. It sticks out of the spear gun about, 4 inches or so.
The spear gun was his trump card, and he pointed it at Sanders, the captain, and he said, "This is a real gun. I'll kill you." And he implored them to cooperate with what he was doing. It was at this point that Tucker took the most extraordinary action.
Tucker had enough presence of mind to take the aircraft with one hand and almost turned it upside down, which threw everyone in the back on top of Auburn Calloway, which gave them a little bit of an advantage. The fact he did that with a crushed skull and only half his body functioning is just phenomenal.
I was looking at this whole situation as if it was an air combat maneuvering situation. You know, the first thing you want to do is engage the bogey, and engage the bad guy. You make him predictable by engaging him, and you use his predictability then against him, and then you kill the bogey. I knew that I had to do something very abrupt, very, very rough, and something that he would not be expecting. So you roll the airplane over on its back and pull through completely in the vertical. But at this particular point, if I'd rolled the airplane over on its back, I wouldn't really be able to see what I was doing. This is not a bubble canopy that you have over the top. You're actually looking out. It's got expansive windows, but nonetheless, you roll this airplane over on its back, you can't really see that much of what you're doing. So I rolled it to about 140 degrees where I could still see out over the side as the airplane's nose was starting to come through. You could tell that you were going quite a bit faster because of things you don't normally hear in a jet that size, and one is the incredible amounts of sound, of wind. If I didn't pull out soon, the airplane was probably going to come apart because I was getting into a phenomenon known as Mach tuck, where the airplane is pitching over because the airspeed is increasing so much. The wind flow over the surfaces of the wings is doing things that it's not even designed to do.
While Captain Sanders and Flight Engineer Peterson grappled with Calloway, Tucker raised the alarm.
Center, emergency. Aircraft with emergency, go ahead.
when we received the call, it just came across the frequency as emergency. So now we have the job of determining who is it that has the emergency.
Aircraft with emergency, say again. To me. Aircraft with emergency, say again.
When we question, aircraft with emergency, say again, well, apparently at the same time we were saying that, they were trying to call us once again. Well, as we did that, our two transmissions blocked each other out, and so all we heard was like the last "uncy" of emergency.
Aircraft with emergency, say again.
This time, he came back and announced that it was, FedEx 705.
Express 705. I've been wounded. We've had an attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a Victor, please. Back to Memphis at this time. Hurry.
Last one we would have expected the emergency to come from was probably the FedEx plane.
Express 705, flying 0905, direct Memphis.
A minute or so went by, and then I got another call, and it said, where's the airport?
Keep me advised, where is Memphis? Express 705, flighting of 090, and to the airport's at 43 miles, 12 o'clock.
I said, it's 12 o'clock and, so many miles. And he said, what direction?
Say my direction to Memphis.
Wait a second, what direction? He was westbound heading for California, and now he's pointed back at the airport and he doesn't know what direction he's flying.
Express 705, you're eastbound at this time, and it'll be about 12:30, 1 o'clock. Look, just keep talking to me, okay?
Jim Tucker is using this aircraft as a weapon, and he's flying it in a way that it's never been flown before, but the purpose is to let the crew have the upper hand. He assures them that he has control of the airplane and that they should get up and resist in any way that they can.
Peterson and Sanders tried to pin Calloway to the galley floor, but their frenzied attacker was biting and lashing out with his hammer.
Yeah, we need an ambulance, and we need armed intervention as well. Alert the airport facility.
When I got him down as low as I thought I could talk to him without losing him on the communications equipment, I shipped him over to Memphis Approach.
Express 705, we have an emergency. He's turning back direct Memphis. He had an attempted takeover. He is wounded at this time.
He's had an attempted takeover?
Affirmative. He's north of Forest City by about 8 miles at this time. He's at 13,000, descending to 10,000.
Okay, radar contact. And you put him on 19-1?
19-1.
Yep.
By now, all three crewmen were back in the galley struggling to overcome Calloway. No one was flying the plane.
When he told them to change frequencies, I think they had it on altitude hold, and they were all in the back in the struggle. And I had tried to call them several times.
Express 705, Heavy, Memphis, out of here. Express 705, Heavy, Memphis, out of here.
Memphis, can you hear me?
Is this Express 705, Heavy?
705, yes.
705 Heavy, Memphis, Roger. I do hear you. You can proceed direct Memphis if able. Expect runway 9er. The altimeter is 302-9er.
You understand we're declaring an emergency. We need security to meet the airplane. We'll stop it on the runway or we can.
Express 705 Heavy, affirmative. All that's been taken care of.
One of the first things you want to do in a hijacking is not make the situation any worse. You don't want to say anything that would anger the hijacker. You want to ask him, hey, does the wacko have a gun? And at that point, it just might push him over the edge. And so you don't want to make the situation any worse, and you want to give all the assistance you can to the pilot, to the crew.
Someone had to try to get the plane down. With First Officer Tucker and Flight Engineer Peterson on top of Calloway, Sanders forced himself back into his bloody captain's seat.
I wasn't sure of the direction of the airplane. I wasn't sure of the condition of the airplane, but it appeared to be flying okay.
Sanders was alone in the cockpit making this maximum speed approach and landing. He was under incredible duress because this fight was still going on. It would ebb and flow, and at times the crew would think that they had the attacker under control, and then the fight would erupt all over again.
It was about the only time I really had time to be frightened, and it was a very horrifying situation at that point, thinking that quite possibly Auburn was winning. There are papers everywhere in the bag. You can see where the jump seats, which is just a normal commercial airline seat, has had the covers torn off. There's bloody footprints on the top of the ceiling. There are coats that have come out of closets. This is certainly a fight against the clock. Auburn's getting stronger. I know we're getting weaker.
I knew if he ever got back in the cockpit, we were history. I just knew we had to keep him, somehow we had to keep him from getting back in that cockpit.
And it was as violent and as loud as when I was in the back in the midst of the fight. It became so violent and loud that approaching 7,000 feet, I decided that I was going to level the airplane, turn on the autopilot, go to the back of the airplane, and kill Calloway.
And I told him, I said, Andy, you know, you got to hit him. You know, he's about ready to, to take us down.
And I guess I gave him kind of a blank stare of, what are you talking about? And he looked at me real stern, like a father would look at his son, saying, you've got to do this. And he said, hit him.
Jim Tucker said to me, David, I think we have him under control now. I said, are you sure?
Express 705 Heavy, verify situation still under control.
Well, it's sort of under control.
As he was coming in, the aircraft was going faster, much faster than normal. There's a speed limit of 250 knots below 10,000 feet. I saw his ground speed was about 350 knots, and I figured this guy wants to get home. That type of aircraft, you have to slow it down to make it descend. Otherwise, it doesn't descend very well. So it turns out he ended up too high for that runway. And at about 4,000 feet, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles out, that's when he said, we're not going to make runway 9. We want 36 left.
I'm coming around to 36 left.
Okay, Express 705 Heavy, runway 36 left. Clear to land. Clear visual approach 36 left. You are clear to land. The wind is 050 at 8.
All other flights into Memphis were diverted. Everyone prepared for the worst.
Dave Sanders was trying to land on runway 9, but ended up very high and very fast, was incapable of putting the aircraft down on the runway. So what he did, he broke off the approach and literally turned like a fighter to a downwind at 36 left.
I wanted the airplane to slow down so that we would not exceed the limits of the landing gear and the flaps, so that we would touch down at or below 195 knots.
The aircraft made a very high banking turn, almost perpendicular to the ground as it made final and onto final approach at the airport. I thought the aircraft was going to crash. I didn't think he could save the airplane in that configuration. The aircraft, as it made its approach, was going over a very highly populated residential area. If the airplane had crashed there, it would have been conceivably loss of life and property. It could have flown into buildings, terminal buildings, airplanes. And a particular concern to me was the very large fuel storage tanks. He hit that, it had been a huge explosion, and it had been quite a catastrophe. The pilot made a beautiful recovery, landed right on the runway, hit very hard, slammed on his brakes, and came to a complete stop.
Exceptional piece of airmanship. You don't see that type of flying in a DC-10. A very nice piece of airmanship by a man who's very fatigued and very injured. It's quite phenomenal.
Paramedic David Teague manned one of the several emergency vehicles summoned the moment Flight 705 raised the alarm. He raced across the tarmac to the now stationary jet.
They came over the loudspeaker system from the air traffic control center, and I was new to the area, so I wasn't able to understand them real well, but I got the words hijacking and some other stuff, and was advised that there had been a hijacking on an airplane.
We pulled up beside the plane, off in the grass, off on the right wingtip.
The bloody three-man crew managed to land safely despite critical injuries.
The captain was saying, somebody help us, get somebody up here before he kills us all.
Paramedics found the crew and suspect Calloway covered with blood.
There was blood on the walls, on the seats that were there. everybody in the cockpit was covered with blood. You had 4 grown men that were fighting for their lives in this confined area for about 30 or 40 minutes. Probably one of the bloodiest scenes that I've seen in my years with the fire department.
The 3-man crew and 1 other person were aboard, an off-duty FedEx pilot, Auburn Calloway, who was just along for the ride.
By just asking, I guess out of my own curiosity, you know, why did you do something like this? And you can just kind of tell when somebody's thinking, and he kind of had that look on his face, and after 15 or 20 seconds, he said, I guess it just went crazy.
Auburn Calloway was sentenced to life. All 3 pilots survived and were honored for their bravery. The practice of allowing employees to fly in jump seats is controversial, but some companies, including FedEx, still allow it. The pilots of Flight 705 have never flown again.
This is a replica of my skull cap. It was put together by use of a CAT scan protocol to give the proper shape of my skull and also the shape of the defect that we're dealing with here. This is the area that I was hit on the left parietal. For a year and a half, I was actually walking around in this configuration. It took 2.5 years to recover completely because I had to learn how to walk, talk, and chew gum all over again. I had 3 major operations. Except that that's when they found out that I had a slight seizure disorder. I'm seizure-free, but it's because I had to take medication. And the only way for me to be able to fly without somebody with me is to be off of medication. At this particular point, it's been ascertained that I'll never be able to do that. I'll be on medication for the rest of my life.
I miss the flying. Every time I see an airplane go over, I wonder where it's going. So I miss that part of it. But I really cherish the fact that, I'm still alive and able to be with my family.
The bond of pilots and what you do together in the airplane, outside the airplane, all that, I miss that. I miss it very much.